Lost and alone in the heart of an unforgiving forest, a helpless bear cub named Dakota finds himself cornered by a ruthless lion pride. Just as all hope fades, a towering grizzly emerges from the shadows, Brutus, a legend of the wild. But why would a lone bear risk everything for a stranger? As Dakota follows his unlikely protector, he uncovers a bond that defies nature itself, where survival means trust, sacrifice, and the unbreakable power of family. The ancient forest stood in eerie silence as dark clouds gathered overhead, thick with the promise of a storm. Towering pines swayed against the bitter wind, their branches creaking, whispering warnings to those who dared roam beneath their shadowed embrace. The distant rumble of thunder sent a shiver through the underbrush, and somewhere deep within, a small bear cub named Dakota hurried along a narrow, winding path, his tiny paws sinking into the damp earth. His heart pounded against his ribs, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. He had been following his mother, Sierra, only moments before, her powerful form a beacon of warmth and safety. But then the storm had come, sudden and fierce, a wall of wind and rain crashing through the forest with merciless force. The roar of the elements had swallowed every familiar sound, drowning out his mother's steady grunts, masking the scent of her fur, leaving him lost, alone, and vulnerable in a world far too vast for his small frame. Dakota whimpered, glancing in every direction, hoping for the familiar sight of Sierra's broad shoulders pushing through the foliage. The towering trees, once comforting, now loomed over him like silent giants, their gnarled roots twisting beneath his paws. The forest floor, usually soft with fallen leaves, was slick with rain, each step an uncertain one. He sniffed the air, hoping to catch a trace of his mother's scent, but all he found was the acrid sting of wet earth and the heavy dampness of pine needles. He let out a weak, trembling call, a desperate cry for Sierra, but the wind snatched it away, carrying it far beyond where she could hear. His ears twitched at the distant crack of thunder, followed by a sharp snap of a breaking branch. Dakota spun around, his pulse quickening. Had it been the storm or something else? The forest was full of dangers, his mother had warned him. Though Dakota had never seen them up close, he knew of the great wolves that hunted in packs, their haunting howls piercing the night. He had heard of the swift, cunning cougars that moved like shadows, their golden eyes watching from above. And there were others, creatures he had only heard whispered about, those whose strength rivaled even his mother's. But none terrified him as much as the thought of being alone. The wind howled through the canopy, bending the trees with a force that sent a fresh wave of fear down Dakota's spine. He pressed himself against the trunk of a fallen log, his small body trembling. Sierra would find him. She had to. She was the strongest bear he had ever known, fierce and unyielding, her claws sharp enough to carve through bark, her growl enough to send any threat running. But the storm had stolen her away, leaving Dakota stranded in a world that felt too large, too wild. He squeezed his eyes shut, curling into himself, hoping that when he opened them, the nightmare would be over. A rustling sound pried his eyes open. At first, he thought it was the wind, but this was different, slow, deliberate. His breath hitched as he peered over the log, his wide, dark eyes scanning the dim-lit forest. There, through the shifting rain and moving shadows, something lurked. A low, guttural growl rose above the storm, sending ice through Dakota's veins. He had never heard a sound like it before, deep and hungry, vibrating through the ground beneath him. Then, emerging from the darkness, a shape moved. Sleek, powerful bodies slipped between the trees, their golden eyes locked onto him with predatory precision. Dakota froze. Lions. He had never seen one up close, only caught their scent on the wind when his mother warned him to stay close. They did not belong in these woods, yet here they were, their massive forms moving like liquid shadows, their paws silent against the wet earth. The largest among them stepped forward, his muscles rippling beneath his tawny coat. His mane was dark and full, framing a face marked with old scars, a testament to the battles he had fought and won. His golden eyes gleamed with something cold, something calculating. Dakota's breath came in short, panicked bursts. His mother had always told him that lions were ruthless, relentless, their hunger never satisfied. And now they were here, closing in on him, their tails flicking, their bodies moving in unison, surrounding him like a pack of wolves. He turned sharply, his claws digging into the slick ground as he bolted, his tiny legs carrying him as fast as they could. Branches whipped at his face, the wind roared in his ears, but nothing drowned out the sound of the lions following. He could hear them, their paws pounding the earth, their breathing steady, their strides longer, stronger. Dakota's heart hammered as he pushed forward, lungs burning, but deep inside he knew he couldn't outrun them. They were built for the hunt, their bodies forged from muscle and speed. Panic clawed at his mind. He needed to hide, needed to escape, but there was nowhere to go, nowhere that the lions wouldn't find him. Then just as his strength began to wane, just as the sharp snap of a lion's jaw closed dangerously close to his flank, Dakota saw it. Ahead, the land sloped downward into a ravine, the rocky edge slick with rain. His mother had warned him about such places, about the danger of falling, the jagged rocks below waiting like hungry teeth. But behind him, death was certain. With a final burst of energy, Dakota leaped. His small body sailed through the rain-soaked air, the world blurring around him. He braced for the impact, for the pain that would come. But instead of sharp rocks, his body landed in thick mud, sliding down the ravine's steep incline. His momentum carried him forward, tumbling, rolling, until finally he crashed against the base of a massive tree. The breath was knocked from his lungs, stars dancing in his vision. He lay still, panting, his limbs aching, but alive. The lions skidded to a stop at the ravine's edge, their eyes peering down at him with frustration, but they did not jump. The slope was too steep, too treacherous. For now he was safe, or so he thought. A new sound rose above the storm, a sound so deep it seemed to shake the very ground beneath him. A growl louder than thunder, more powerful than any Dakota had ever heard. His fur bristled as a massive shadow moved in the darkness. Heavy paws crushed the earth, branches snapped under unimaginable weight. Dakota's breath hitched. Something was coming, something even the lions hesitated to challenge. And then from the darkness of the trees, a figure emerged. Towering, massive, a beast unlike any he had ever seen. A grizzly. His fur was thick and matted with age, his muscles rippling beneath the scars of countless battles. His eyes, dark and knowing, locked onto Dakota, then flicked to the lions above. The lions snarled but did not move forward. They knew what he was, knew his name. Brutus, a legend among beasts, a warrior of the wild, and he was standing between them and their prey. Dakota's chest rose and fell in rapid bursts as he stared at the monstrous bear before him. He had been saved, but by what? By whom? His instincts screamed at him to run, but his legs refused to move. Brutus turned his massive head toward Dakota, his expression unreadable. Then with a single earth-shaking growl, he turned back to the lions, his stance shifting, his claws unsheathing. The storm raged on, but now it was no longer the most dangerous force in the forest. Brutus had arrived, and the battle had only just begun. The air was thick with tension, the scent of rain and pine mingling with the primal musk of predator and prey. Dakota lay where he had fallen, his small chest rising and falling in panic bursts, his fur slick with mud and rain. Above him, the lions prowled the ridge, their eyes locked on the massive grizzly that had emerged from the shadows, like some ancient guardian of the forest. Brutus stood tall, his sheer size dwarfing even the largest lion among them. His fur, a patchwork of deep brown and silver streaks from old wounds, bristled as he let out another growl, low and rumbling, a sound that vibrated through Dakota's tiny frame and sent a clear message. This land was his, and he would not suffer trespassers. The lions hesitated. Kovu, their leader, took a step forward, his golden mane damp and wild from the rain. His lips curled back, revealing ivory fangs that had torn through countless creatures before. Dakota had never seen anything so terrifying, but Brutus did not flinch. He remained still, a fortress of muscle and instinct, his dark eyes locked onto the pride with an unshakable authority. The storm raged on, wind whipping through the trees, bending branches to their breaking point, and still neither side moved. The only sound was the distant rumble of thunder and the faint whimper of Dakota, who pressed himself into the mud, desperate to make himself small, unseen. Kovu snarled, his tail lashing, but he did not attack. He knew of Brutus. Every creature in the wild knew of the ancient bear who had walked these woods for years, who had survived battles that should have killed him, who had faced down packs of wolves, and even men with iron weapons, and emerged victorious. Brutus was not prey, and the lions, despite their arrogance, understood the difference between a challenge and a death sentence. The grizzly took a step forward, the ground trembling beneath his weight, and with that single movement, the pride wavered. Kovu let out a sharp bark, a reluctant command for retreat, and one by one the lions turned away, their hunger unsatisfied, but their survival instinct stronger than their pride. Dakota watched them vanish into the mist, their golden forms slipping between the trees like ghosts, until finally he was alone with the massive bear that had saved him. Silence settled over the ravine, broken only by the patter of rain against the leaves. Brutus exhaled, shaking his thick coat, sending droplets flying in all directions. Then, to Dakota's horror, the bear turned his gaze down toward him. Instinct screamed for the cub to run, but his legs were weak, trembling, his body too exhausted from fear and cold to obey. He braced himself, waiting for the final blow, for the crushing weight of claws and teeth, but it never came. Brutus simply stared, his expression unreadable, then let out a deep huff and lowered himself onto his haunches, his massive frame still dwarfing Dakota. The cub's ears flattened against his skull as he tried to press himself further into the mud, convinced that at any moment the bear would lose interest in playing protector and decide he was just another small, easy meal. But Brutus did not strike. Instead, he reached out with one enormous paw, nudging Dakota's side with surprising gentleness, as if testing to see if he was still alive. The cub let out a small squeak of surprise, his heart hammering in his chest. Brutus grunted, then with a slow and deliberate movement, he turned and began to walk away. For a moment, Dakota remained frozen, unsure whether to feel relieved or abandoned. His mother had always told him that bears were solitary, that they did not take in strangers, especially not those outside their own kin. But the storm was still raging, the cold biting deeper into his small frame, and the thought of being alone again sent a fresh wave of terror through him. His mother was out there somewhere, but he had no idea how to find her, no idea which direction was safe. And now the only creature that had shown him mercy was leaving? Panic seized him. With a burst of desperate energy, Dakota scrambled to his paws, his small legs unsteady as he stumbled forward. "Wait!" His voice was little more than a squeak, lost beneath the wind. But Brutus stopped. The grizzly turned his head slightly, one dark eye regarding the cub with something that might have been mild curiosity. Dakota's breath hitched as he hesitated, realizing he had no idea what he was doing, no idea what he was asking for. He just knew he didn't want to be left behind. Brutus snorted, shaking his head, then continued walking. Dakota hesitated for only a second before bounding after him, his paws slipping in the mud as he struggled to keep up with the bear's long strides. The grizzly did not stop him. He did not acknowledge him, nor did he turn him away. He simply walked, his massive shoulders shifting beneath the weight of age and power, moving through the storm as if it were nothing more than a passing breeze. Dakota followed, his legs burning with effort, his small frame dwarfed by the sheer enormity of the bear ahead of him. He had no plan, no guarantee of safety, only the knowledge that this creature had faced the same storm and had not fallen. And for now, that was enough. The journey was slow, the terrain rough and unforgiving. The storm had turned the forest into a treacherous landscape of slick rocks and fallen branches. But Brutus moved through it with ease, his steps deliberate, his senses sharp. Dakota did his best to mimic the bear's movements, stepping where he stepped, avoiding the deeper patches of mud that threatened to swallow his tiny paws. His mother had always told him that survival was about watching, learning, adapting. And so he watched. He watched the way Brutus lifted his nose to the wind, sniffing for danger before moving forward. He watched the way the grizzly's ears twitched at the slightest sound, his massive paws stepping lightly despite their size. By the time they reached a clearing, Dakota was drenched, his fur matted with mud, his legs aching from the effort. Brutus stopped at the mouth of a cave nestled beneath a rocky overhang, its entrance wide and dark, smelling of earth and old bark. Without hesitation, the grizzly stepped inside, his body disappearing into the shadows. Dakota hesitated. The cave was unfamiliar, intimidating, but so was everything else now. The forest was vast and filled with predators, and out there alone, he would not last the night. He swallowed hard, then took a tentative step forward, his small body slipping into the mouth of the cave. It was warmer inside, the wind unable to reach him here. Brutus settled onto the ground with a heavy sigh, his massive form taking up most of the space. Dakota lingered near the entrance, shivering, uncertain. The bear did not speak. Bears never did. But there was no hostility in his gaze, only patience, perhaps even understanding. With a deep breath, Dakota curled into a small ball near the edge of the cave, his body finally surrendering to exhaustion. The storm howled outside, but for the first time since he had lost his mother, he did not feel entirely alone. As sleep began to pull him under, he dared to hope. Perhaps Brutus would not send him away. Perhaps against all odds, he had found a protector in the most unlikely of places. And for now, that was enough. The storm continued to howl outside the cave, the wind whistling through the narrow entrance, like the whispers of unseen spirits. Dakota lay curled in the farthest corner, his small body still trembling despite the shelter. The stone beneath him was cold, rough against his damp fur, but it was better than the rain, better than the open woods where hungry eyes waited in the darkness. He watched Brutus through half-lidded eyes, exhaustion weighing on him like a heavy stone. The grizzly had settled down on the other side of the cave, his massive frame stretching across the rocky floor, unbothered by the cold or the storm. His breathing was slow, steady, each rise and fall of his chest like the deep, rhythmic movement of the earth itself. Dakota had never seen a bear like him before. His mother was strong, the strongest creature he had ever known. But Brutus was something else, larger, older, with scars carved into his thick fur, like the markings of an ancient warrior. There was something in the way he carried himself, something that spoke of battles fought and won, of years spent alone in the wild, answering to no one. Dakota had always been told that grizzlies were dangerous, but here he was, sharing a cave with one, breathing the same air, listening to the same storm. And yet Brutus had not hurt him. He had not chased him away. He had saved him. The thought lingered in Dakota's mind, a quiet ember in the darkness of his fear. He still did not understand why. Bears did not protect others, not outside their own blood, and even then, only for a time. When a cub grew old enough, they were sent away, forced to carve their own place in the world, to survive or fall as nature intended. But Brutus had chosen to stand between him and the lions, had chosen to let him follow, had chosen to let him stay. Dakota's ears twitched as he listened to the wind outside, the distant creak of bending trees, the occasional crack of a falling branch. The forest had changed for him. It no longer felt like the place he had known, the place where his mother had kept him safe. Now it was something vast and cruel, filled with things that hunted in the shadows, with dangers he had never before considered. If he had been alone, he would not have survived. That truth settled deep into his chest, curling around his heart like roots tightening around stone. He did not want to be alone. Not now, not ever. Brutus shifted, his great form rising slightly, his eyes opening to slits as he let out a low rumble, something between a grunt and a sigh. Dakota stiffened, uncertain if he had done something wrong. But the old grizzly did not move toward him. Instead, he turned his heavy head and sniffed the air, his nostrils flaring as he caught something on the wind. Dakota sat up, his ears perking. He smelled nothing beyond the dampness of stone and the lingering scent of rain. But Brutus was older, wiser. The grizzly exhaled sharply, pushing himself up onto his haunches, his thick fur bristling as he moved toward the entrance of the cave. Dakota hesitated, unsure whether to stay where he was or follow. Then with a deep breath, he scrambled to his feet and padded after Brutus, keeping a careful distance. Outside, the storm had begun to wane, the rain easing into a soft drizzle. the trees swaying less violently beneath the weight of the wind. The sky was still dark, clouds heavy with the remnants of the storm. But there was a stillness now, a quiet that felt like the deep breath before something unknown. Brutus stood at the mouth of the cave, his gaze scanning the forest below, his muscles coiled as if expecting something to emerge from the underbrush. Dakota followed his line of sight, but all he could see were the endless trees, the mist curling between them like ghosts. He swallowed hard, his paws kneading nervously against the wet stone. "What is it?" he dared to whisper, though he knew the grizzly would not answer. But Brutus did respond in his own way. He let out a low, warning growl, his ears flicking back for only a moment before he took a step forward. Dakota's breath hitched. Was he leaving? Was this the moment he would be left behind? Panic surged through him, hot and sharp, and before he could stop himself, he stumbled after the grizzly, his small voice breaking the silence. "Wait!" Brutus did stop then, turning his massive head, his dark eyes narrowing slightly as he regarded the cub. Dakota's heart pounded, but he forced himself to stand tall, to keep his paws steady even as his legs trembled. He didn't know what he was asking for. He only knew he didn't want to go back to being alone. The grizzly huffed, his breath visible in the cold air. Then, with what seemed like reluctant acceptance, he turned back toward the forest and continued forward. Dakota hesitated only for a second before following. The descent from the cave was treacherous, the rocks slick with rain, the path narrow and uneven. Brutus moved with practiced ease, his heavy paws finding purchase where Dakota's small ones slipped and stumbled. The cub struggled to keep up, his breaths coming faster as he forced himself forward. He did not ask where they were going. He did not know if he was allowed to. He only knew that as long as Brutus did not turn him away, he would follow. The forest stretched wide before them, vast and unfamiliar, the trees looming high like silent sentinels. The scent of rain clung to the air, mixing with the rich earth and the distant musk of animals that had taken shelter from the storm. Dakota's nose twitched as he picked up faint traces of other creatures. Deer, foxes, something larger far in the distance. But none of them were his mother. His chest tightened at the thought of her searching for him, calling for him, perhaps even fearing the worst. He wanted to find her. He needed to, but he did not know how. Brutus continued forward, his movements purposeful, his steps leading them deeper into the forest. Dakota followed in silence, his mind racing with unspoken questions. Why was the grizzly allowing him to come? Where were they going? Would he ever see his mother again? But Brutus did not speak, did not glance back, did not offer any answers. He was a creature of instinct, of action, not words. And so Dakota did what he had been taught. He watched, he listened, he learned. The grizzly was not simply wandering, he was hunting. Dakota could see it in the way his head lowered. His ears flicked at every sound. His nose twitched as he caught scents on the wind. The realization made Dakota's stomach twist. He had not eaten since before the storm, and now hunger gnawed at him, a dull ache that made his paws feel heavier with each step. Then without warning, Brutus stopped. Dakota nearly crashed into him, stumbling back as the grizzly lowered himself into a crouch, his eyes locked onto something ahead. Dakota followed his gaze, and there, just beyond the ferns, was a clearing where a small herd of elk grazed, their sleek bodies moving with quiet grace. Dakota's breath caught. He had watched his mother hunt before, had seen the way she moved, the way she waited for the perfect moment to strike. Now he watched Brutus do the same. The grizzly was still, impossibly still for something so large. The air felt thick, charged with the tension of the moment. Then in a single heartbeat, Brutus lunged. The forest erupted into chaos, hooves striking the ground, bodies scattering. Dakota's eyes widened as he watched the grizzly give chase, his power undeniable, his movements a lesson in survival. And for the first time since losing his mother, Dakota understood. This was what it meant to be wild. The moment Brutus lunged, the world became a blur of movement and sound. The elk scattered in every direction, their hooves pounding against the wet earth, their panicked grunts cutting through the heavy mist that clung to the trees. Dakota's breath hitched as he watched the grizzly move, his massive frame deceptively fast, his muscles rippling with every stride. The forest seemed to tremble beneath his weight, leaves shaking loose from the trees as he tore through the undergrowth in pursuit of his target. Dakota had seen his mother hunt before, had watched her stalk and strike with calculated precision, but Brutus was different. There was no hesitation in his movements, no moment of careful observation before the attack. He was a force of nature, relentless, unstoppable. His focus locked entirely on the weakest elk that lagged behind the others, its long legs struggling to find footing on the rain-slicked ground. Dakota's instincts screamed at him to stay back, to keep still, to let the predator do his work. But something deep inside him, something primal, made him step forward, his small paws sinking into the mud as he strained to see what would happen next. The elk let out a desperate cry as it twisted sharply, trying to evade Brutus, its muscles coiling as it pushed forward with everything it had. For a brief moment, it seemed as though it might escape, its lean body vanishing into the mist. But then Brutus surged forward, his enormous paw swinging out with terrifying speed. The impact sent the elk crashing onto its side, its legs flailing as it tried to scramble back to its feet. But Brutus was already there, his teeth bared, his powerful jaws clamping down onto the animal's throat. A sharp, wet snap filled the air, followed by silence, thick and heavy. The rest of the herd had vanished, their presence nothing more than rustling leaves in the distance. Dakota swallowed hard, his body frozen in place as he stared at the lifeless form before him, the scent of blood thick in the air, mingling with the damp earth and the remnants of the storm. He had never been this close to a kill before, had never seen the moment life was taken, had never smelled death in its rawest form. His mother had always shielded him from it, bringing food to him rather than letting him witness the hunt. But Brutus did no such thing. The grizzly stepped back, his dark eyes shifting toward Dakota, his expression unreadable as he studied the cub. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Dakota's chest rose and fell in shallow, uneven breaths, his mind struggling to process what he had just seen. He knew logically that this was how the wild worked. His mother had told him as much, had explained that survival meant taking what was needed, that predators hunted not out of cruelty but necessity. And yet, standing here, watching the lifeless elk bleed into the earth, he felt something tighten inside him, something uncertain, something afraid. Brutus huffed, shaking his thick fur, then turned away from the kill, leaving it untouched as he began to move toward the trees. Dakota blinked in confusion. The grizzly had gone through the effort of the hunt, had spent his energy bringing the elk down, and now he was simply walking away? His stomach twisted with hunger, a dull, aching reminder of how long it had been since he last ate. And yet Brutus was leaving the food behind. Dakota hesitated, his paws shifting in the mud as he cast one last glance at the elk before bounding after the bear, struggling to keep up with the long strides that carried Brutus deeper into the forest. The silence between them was suffocating, broken only by the distant call of crows and the soft rustling of leaves in the wind. Dakota's thoughts raced, questions swirling in his mind, but he did not dare voice them. He did not yet understand this bear, did not yet know what lines he could and could not cross. Instead, he simply followed, his small legs burning with the effort, his breath coming in short, quick bursts. Brutus did not slow for him, did not offer any reassurance, did not look back to make sure he was still there. He simply moved, steady and unyielding, as if Dakota's presence did not matter at all. The cub clenched his jaw, frustration bubbling in his chest. He had lost his mother, had faced down lions, had survived a storm, and yet this bear barely acknowledged him. What was he supposed to do? Keep following forever? Wait until Brutus finally grew tired of him and sent him away? The thought made his stomach tighten, but before he could dwell on it further, the grizzly stopped. Dakota nearly crashed into him, stumbling back with a startled grunt before looking up, his eyes wide with confusion. Brutus had led him to a small clearing, the ground covered in thick moss, the air damp with the scent of fresh rain. In the center of the space sat a fallen tree, its bark stripped away, its trunk hollowed out by years of decay. Brutus moved toward it, his nose twitching as he sniffed at the exposed wood. Then, without warning, he reared up onto his hind legs and brought his massive paws down onto the log with enough force to split it apart. Dakota flinched at the sudden crack, his fur bristling as pieces of wood splintered in all directions. But then he caught the scent of something sweet, something rich, something familiar. Brutus reached into the broken log, his claws pulling away chunks of damp wood to reveal the golden, glistening combs of a honey hive nestled inside. Dakota's mouth watered at the sight, his hunger momentarily overriding his uncertainty, and before he could think twice, he stepped forward. Brutus did not stop him. The grizzly simply tore off a piece of the hive with his teeth, chewing lazily as he settled onto his haunches. Dakota hesitated for only a second before lunging forward, his small teeth sinking into the sticky honeycomb, the taste exploding across his tongue. It was warm, thick with sweetness, the kind of food his mother had always searched for but rarely found. He ate greedily, his paws sticky with golden syrup, his hunger momentarily satisfied. For the first time since the storm, since he had been separated from his mother, since he had found himself lost and afraid, he felt something close to comfort. Brutus watched him, silent as ever, his dark eyes unreadable. But there was something in his gaze that felt different now. It was not kindness, not exactly, but it was not indifference either. It was something in between, something Dakota could not yet name. They stayed like that for a while, the cub eating, the grizzly watching, the forest quiet around them. The world felt smaller here, tucked away from the dangers that lurked beyond the trees. And though Dakota knew this peace would not last forever, he allowed himself to sink into it just for a little while. Brutus finally stood, his massive form shifting as he turned away from the shattered log, and without hesitation, Dakota followed. He did not know where they were going, did not know if Brutus intended to keep him, did not know if this strange truce between them would last. But for now, he was not alone, and for now that was enough. The forest stretched endlessly before them, a vast sea of towering pines and winding underbrush, each step taking them deeper into its shadowed embrace. Dakota followed Brutus without question now, his small paws pressing into the damp earth, his muscles sore from the endless movement. But he did not complain. He did not dare. The grizzly walked with purpose, his massive shoulders rolling beneath his thick fur, his head swaying slightly with each heavy step. He did not look back to see if Dakota was keeping up, did not pause to check if the cub was struggling. He expected him to follow, and so Dakota did. He had no other choice. The honey from the hive had settled in his stomach, warm and thick, but it was not enough to banish the gnawing ache of hunger that still lurked beneath his ribs. He had eaten, but not the way Brutus had. The grizzly had torn into the combs with practiced ease, biting through wax and swallowing the rich sweetness without hesitation. But Dakota had been more delicate, licking at the honey, chewing hesitantly. He was still young. He had not yet learned the ways of a true predator. His mother had always hunted for him, always brought him food, had always been there. But she was not here now, and Brutus would not provide for him like she had. The realization sat heavy in his chest, an unspoken truth that made his steps feel slower, his body smaller. He would have to learn. He would have to survive. Brutus stopped suddenly, his dark eyes narrowing as he lifted his nose to the wind. Dakota nearly ran into him but skidded to a halt, his ears flattening instinctively as he waited, sensing the shift in the air. The grizzly sniffed again, his nostrils flaring, his body going still, muscles tense beneath his thick coat. Dakota swallowed, his breath caught in his throat, and then he smelled it too. Not the rich scent of honey or the damp musk of the earth after rain. Something else, something sharp, unfamiliar, smoke. Dakota's fur bristled as his head turned toward the source, his heart pounding. The scent was faint but unmistakable, drifting through the trees like a warning carried on the wind. His mother had told him about fire, about the destruction it brought, how it moved like a living thing, swallowing everything in its path, leaving nothing behind but ash and ruin. He had never seen one before, but instinct told him to be afraid. Brutus grunted, his expression unreadable. Then without a sound, he changed direction, moving toward the scent instead of away from it. Dakota hesitated, his paws shifting against the damp ground, a flicker of uncertainty dancing in his chest. Fire was danger. Fire was death. Shouldn't they run? But Brutus did not run. He walked steadily, his pace unhurried, his body language calm but focused. Dakota clenched his jaw, his breath uneven, then forced his legs to move, forcing himself to follow the grizzly into the unknown. The scent grew stronger as they pushed forward, winding between trees and climbing over thick roots, the smoke curling in the air like ghostly fingers reaching for them. Dakota's throat tightened as the first flickers of orange light became visible through the dense foliage, small embers drifting upward, dancing in the air before vanishing into the night. A campfire. Dakota had never seen one before, but he had heard stories, had listened to his mother speak of the two-legged creatures that roamed the forest, the ones that carried fire, that hunted not with claws or teeth, but with strange, deadly tools. Humans. Dakota's stomach twisted as he inched closer, his instincts screaming at him to turn back, but Brutus showed no fear. He moved like he had seen this before, like he understood what they were approaching, like he had already decided what he would do. Through the gaps in the trees, Dakota could see them now. 3 figures wrapped in thick coverings, their faces hidden in the flickering light of the fire. They sat around the flames, their voices low, murmuring sounds that made no sense to Dakota's ears. A strange, acrid scent clung to the air, mixing with the smoke, something unnatural, something that did not belong in the forest. Dakota shrank back instinctively, his small body pressing into the shadows, but Brutus remained where he was, watching. The grizzly's eyes were sharp, his expression unreadable, and for a moment, Dakota wondered if he had been wrong about him, if maybe Brutus was not just some old bear surviving in the wild, but something else entirely, something more. The humans laughed suddenly, one of them standing, stretching their limbs as the firelight danced against their pale skin. Dakota flinched at the sound, every muscle in his body tensing, but Brutus did not react. He simply stared, unmoving, unshaken, waiting. And then Dakota saw it. Just beyond the fire, tied to a thick post of wood, a creature sat hunched, its body thin, its fur matted. A dog. Dakota had never seen one before, had never been close enough to smell one, but he had heard of them, had listened to his mother speak of how humans kept them, trained them, made them obey. But this one did not look like a fierce hunter or a loyal companion. This one looked broken. Its ribs showed through its thin coat, its eyes dull, its body barely lifting as it let out a weak whimper. Dakota's chest tightened at the sound, his breath catching. Something was wrong. He didn't understand everything about humans, but he understood pain, understood hunger, understood the way the dog's body trembled as if it had been left alone in the cold for too long. He felt that same cold in his own bones, the same loneliness. Brutus let out a low, almost imperceptible growl, his ears flicking back slightly as if in recognition. And then, to Dakota's utter disbelief, he moved forward. Not fast, not recklessly, but with purpose. Dakota's heart pounded as he watched the massive grizzly step out of the shadows, the firelight catching the scars along his body. The sheer weight of him making the earth feel smaller beneath his paws. The humans froze, their voices cutting off instantly, their heads snapping toward the movement. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Dakota stayed hidden, his body pressed into the darkness, his mind screaming at him to run, but he could not look away. Brutus did not charge. He did not roar. He simply stood there, his eyes locked onto the humans, his presence alone enough to make them recoil. One of them stumbled back, scrambling for something near the fire. A weapon, maybe, though Dakota did not know what kind. Another one shouted, their voice sharp with fear. And then, in the blink of an eye, Brutus moved. Not toward them, but toward the dog. The rope that held it was thick, twisted tightly around the post, but it meant nothing to Brutus. With a single swipe of his massive claws, the fibers snapped, the tension releasing in an instant. The dog collapsed forward, too weak to stand, but Brutus did not wait. He turned, already retreating, already moving back toward the forest. The humans were yelling now, their voices rising in panic, but Brutus did not care. He had done what he had come to do. Dakota's legs finally obeyed him, and he turned, bolting after the grizzly, his heart hammering, his mind spinning with questions he could not yet ask. The dog stumbled behind them, struggling to keep up, but Brutus did not slow down. and neither did Dakota. They ran deeper into the night, away from the fire, away from the humans, away from the world that did not understand them. And for the first time, Dakota realized something. Brutus was not just a beast of the wild. He was something more, something the forest itself had forged, a protector. The night wrapped around them like a thick, endless shroud, the forest stretching in every direction, its depths swallowing them as they ran. Dakota's lungs burned, his small paws struggling to keep pace with Brutus's massive strides, the ground slick beneath him from the lingering dampness of the storm. Behind them, the dog stumbled, its legs weak from starvation and mistreatment, but it pushed forward, driven by some primal instinct, some understanding that to stop now would mean death. The distant shouts of the humans still rang in Dakota's ears, their voices sharp with panic, but they were growing fainter, swallowed by the trees, consumed by the night. They would not follow. They would not dare. Not into the domain of the grizzly. Not into the place where the wild things ruled. Brutus did not stop, did not glance back to see if they were keeping up, did not offer them reassurance or guidance. He simply moved, relentless and steady, weaving through the underbrush with a practiced ease that made it clear he knew this forest better than anything else in the world. Dakota's legs ached, his muscles screaming for rest, but he did not allow himself to slow. He could not. He would not. He was not a cub lost and afraid anymore. He was something else now, something forged in the fire of survival, in the depths of the storm, in the gaze of a bear who had chosen to let him stay. He belonged here, with Brutus, with the creatures that did not speak but still understood. The dog faltered behind him, its breath coming in ragged gasps, and for a moment Dakota considered stopping, considered turning back to help. But before he could, Brutus finally came to a halt, his massive form still as a boulder, his ears twitching as he listened to the silence of the night. Dakota skidded to a stop beside him, his small chest rising and falling in frantic bursts, his breath loud in the quiet. The dog collapsed a few steps behind them, its thin body trembling, its ribs rising and falling beneath its patchy fur. For a long moment, none of them moved. The only sound was the wind shifting through the trees, the distant call of an owl, the whisper of the river somewhere beyond the ridge. Brutus exhaled, a deep rumbling sound, then turned toward the dog, his dark eyes unreadable. Dakota swallowed, stepping hesitantly closer, his instincts warring with his curiosity. He had never been this close to a dog before, had never seen one outside the stories his mother had told him. This one was smaller than he expected, its fur matted and filthy, its body so thin that it looked more like a shadow than something alive. And yet, despite its weakness, there was a fire in its eyes, a defiance that had not yet been extinguished. The dog lifted its head slightly, its dull gaze shifting between Dakota and Brutus, its body tensing as if expecting another blow, another punishment. But Brutus did not move to strike. He did not growl, did not bare his teeth, did not show the slightest hint of aggression. Instead, he simply stared, his expression steady, as if measuring something unseen. Then with a slow, deliberate motion, he turned and walked a few steps away, leaving Dakota standing between him and the dog, uncertain, waiting. Dakota glanced up at him, confusion flickering in his chest. What was he supposed to do? What did Brutus expect of him? He looked back at the dog, at the way its body shivered, at the way its paws curled inward, as if bracing for pain. Something inside him twisted, something he did not fully understand. But before he could question it, he stepped forward. The dog flinched. Not much. Just a twitch, a flicker of fear that passed over its eyes like a shadow. Dakota hesitated, lowering his head slightly, making himself smaller, less threatening. He had seen his mother do this before, when approaching something fragile, something scared. The dog's ears flicked, its muscles still tense, but it did not move away. Carefully, slowly, Dakota reached out with his nose, his breath warm against the dog's damp fur. He could smell the fear clinging to it, thick and suffocating, but beneath that, something else, something familiar. The scent of survival, the scent of something that refused to give up. The dog let out a slow, shaky exhale, and for the first time its body relaxed, just slightly. Dakota nudged it gently, the way his mother had once nudged him when he was small, when he had been afraid. The dog blinked, its eyes tired, its body still weak, but it did not pull away. It stayed. Dakota let out a breath he had not realized he was holding. He turned back to Brutus, half expecting to see approval in the old bear's gaze, some sign that he had done the right thing. But Brutus did not offer praise. He simply turned and walked away, as if the matter had already been decided. Dakota frowned, glancing between the grizzly and the dog, uncertainty gripping him. Then he understood. Brutus had not just saved the dog, he had given Dakota a choice, a moment to decide what kind of creature he would become. The cub stared after the bear, then looked back at the dog, at the way it struggled to stand, at the quiet determination in its eyes. And just like that, the choice was made. Dakota moved beside the dog, nudging it gently, urging it to rise. It hesitated then, with great effort, it pushed itself to its paws, unsteady but standing. Dakota did not wait. He turned and followed Brutus into the darkness, and the dog, after only a moment's pause, followed him. The forest swallowed them once more, the night stretching long and endless. But for the first time since the storm, since the lions, since losing his mother, Dakota did not feel alone. He was not just a cub struggling to survive anymore. He was something more, something wild, something that understood the unspoken language of those who refused to break, who refused to be beaten down by the world. The night stretched on, but they kept moving, following the silent path that Brutus laid before them, a path that did not promise safety, did not promise comfort, but promised something greater. A place in the wild, a place where survival was not given but earned, a place where creatures like them, small, broken, but unyielding, could carve out a life of their own. And so they walked, the bear, the cub, and the dog, their forms slipping through the trees like shadows, vanishing into the night. The fire from the humans' camp was long behind them, the storm just a distant memory, the fear of being lost nothing more than a whisper in the wind. They had found something in the darkness, something that was neither family nor fate, but something just as strong. A bond forged not by blood, not by words, but by survival. And as the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, spilling gold across the treetops, Dakota knew that whatever came next, whatever dangers, whatever trials, whatever battles awaited them, he would not face them alone, not anymore.